The sledgehammer struck the door with a thunderous crack that echoed through Maple Grove's pristine suburban silence. Inside 247 Elderberry Lane, 73-year-old Samuel Washington didn't flinch. He'd heard worse sounds in places most people couldn't imagine. "This is a lawful inspection," barked Margaret Thornfield, HOA president, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that comes from never having it questioned. Behind her stood 3 other board members and what she called her compliance team. Neighbors turned enforcers, clipboards in hand like weapons of suburban warfare. Samuel opened the door slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos erupting on his front porch. For 6 months, they'd been circling like vultures. First came the notices. His grass was 2 inches too high, his mailbox needed repainting, his garden gnome violated the aesthetic standards of their gated community. Each violation carried a fine. Each fine went unpaid. "Mr. Washington," Margaret's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, "your continued non-compliance has forced our hand. Per Section 12.7 of the Maple Grove Charter, we're conducting a full property inspection." The old man said nothing. His dark eyes, clouded with age but sharp with intelligence, watched as they pushed past him into his modest home. What they saw confirmed their worst assumptions. An elderly black man, living alone, surviving on what appeared to be a modest pension, clearly unable to maintain their community's standards. But they were about to discover they had made the gravest mistake of their lives. Samuel Washington had moved to Maple Grove 3 years earlier, purchasing the small ranch house with his life savings. After decades of moving from base to base, city to city, he'd finally found a quiet corner of the world where he could tend his garden and live out his remaining year, was in peace. The trouble began almost immediately. Margaret Thornfield lived in the community's crown jewel, a sprawling colonial that overlooked the golf course. She'd been HOA president for 12 years, ruling the 200-home development with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive politeness. Property values were her religion, and anyone who threatened them was a heretic to be expelled. Samuel's crime? He dared to be different in a place that demanded conformity. His lawn wasn't the chemical-fed emerald carpet that stretched across neighboring yards. Instead, he'd planted native wildflowers that attracted butterflies and birds. His mailbox bore the patina of age rather than the glossy perfection the HOA demanded. Most offensive of all, he'd placed a small garden gnome, a gift from his late wife, among the tomatoes in his backyard. The fines started small. $25 for non-conforming landscaping, $50 for mailbox deterioration, $75 for the gnome. Samuel paid the first few, hoping to keep the peace, but they kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. When he stopped paying, Margaret escalated. "That man is destroying our property values," she declared at emergency board meetings. "He's turning our community into... Well, you can see what's happening. The coded language wasn't lost on anyone. Samuel was the only black resident in Maple Grove, a fact that some neighbors whispered about behind manicured hedges. Margaret was careful never to say it outright, but her meaning was clear. Samuel didn't belong. The harassment intensified. Code enforcement officers appeared weekly, measuring grass height with rulers. The mailman was instructed to photograph any violations. Neighbors were encouraged to report infractions through an anonymous tip line Margaret had established. But Samuel endured it all with quiet dignity, speaking little, revealing nothing about his past. His neighbors saw only what they chose to see. an old man who didn't fit their vision of suburban perfection. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Search every room," Margaret commanded as her team spread through Samuel's home like an occupying force. "Document everything. I want photographs, measurements, a complete inventory of violations." Samuel watched from his kitchen table, his hands folded calmly in front of him. On the wall behind him hung a simple wooden cross and a faded photograph of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, his late wife Maria, taken 40 years ago. The compliance team moved with the ruthless efficiency of people drunk on petty power. They measured window treatments, photographed furniture arrangements, and documented every item that didn't conform to the HOA's exhaustive list of approved home accessories. In the living room, board member Dennis Fletcher held up a measuring tape. "This entertainment center is 3 inches too wide for the space allocation guidelines," he announced, with the gravity of someone uncovering war crimes. Margaret nodded approvingly, making notes on her tablet. "Non-conforming furniture placement. That's another violation." But it was board member Janet Mills who made the discovery that would change everything. She'd wandered into Samuel's bedroom, camera in hand, ready to document whatever violations awaited. The room was sparse. A simple bed, a worn dresser, and a wooden chest at the foot of the bed that looked like it had seen decades of use. "What's in here?" she called out, her voice carrying the excitement of someone about to uncover a smoking gun. The chest was locked, but Margaret had come prepared. "Property inspection includes all storage areas," she declared, producing a crowbar from her toolkit. "Mr. Washington, open this immediately or we'll open it ourselves." Samuel's voice, when it finally came, was quiet but firm. "I'd rather not." "Too bad," Margaret sneered, signaling to Fletcher to force the lock. The old mechanism gave way with a sharp crack. Janet threw open the lid, her camera ready to document whatever contraband or code violations lay inside. What she found instead made her stumble backward, her face draining of color. The chest was filled with military memorabilia, but not the kind found in army surplus stores. These were the real thing, medals, citations, and commendations that told a story none of them had expected. A bronze star gleamed against faded velvet. A purple heart lay nestled beside campaign ribbons from Vietnam, but it was the small, unassuming medal at the bottom that made Janet's hands tremble as she lifted it into the light. The Medal of Honor. America's highest military decoration, awarded to only the most heroic of heroes. But what happened next shocked everyone even more. The climax. The silence in Samuel's bedroom was deafening. Margaret Thornfield stood frozen in the doorway, her clipboard hanging limply at her side, as Janet held up the Medal of Honor with shaking hands. This can't be real," Margaret whispered. But even as she spoke, she knew it was. The weight of the medal, the aged ribbon, the simple inscription on back, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Samuel appeared in the doorway, his weathered face calm, but his eyes holding depths of memory that suddenly made sense. "Please, put that down," he said quietly. "It belongs to men better than me." But Fletcher, the board's self-appointed military expert who'd never served a day in uniform, was already reading from one of the citations he'd pulled from the chest. His voice cracked as the words registered. "Staff Sergeant Samuel Washington, 1st Infantry Division, single-handedly held his position against overwhelming enemy forces for 6 hours, refusing evacuation despite severe wounds. saved the lives of 43 fellow soldiers. The room spun as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't some stolen valor case or military surplus collection. These were the real decorations of a genuine American hero. Margaret's face had gone ashen. She looked from the medals to Samuel, seeing him for the first time, not as the elderly nuisance she'd been trying to drive away, but as the man he truly was. You're that Samuel Washington," she whispered. "The one from the documentary, the Congressional Medal of Honor recipient who—" Samuel nodded once, his dignity intact, even as his most private memories lay exposed. "I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to tend my garden in peace." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. For months, they'd been harassing a man whose service to his country made their petty neighborhood squabbles look like the small-minded persecution they truly were. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Janet, still holding the Medal of Honor, noticed an envelope at the bottom of the chest. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out and read the letterhead aloud. Department of Veterans Affairs, Disability Compensation. The letter was recent, detailing Samuel's 100% service-connected disability rating for injuries sustained in Vietnam, the same injuries that made it difficult for him to maintain his lawn to HOA standards, the same physical limitations that prevented him from repainting his mailbox as frequently as the board demanded. Margaret Thornfield, suburban tyrant and self-appointed guardian of property values, stood face to face with the realization that she'd been systematically harassing a disabled war hero for having the audacity to live quietly in the community he'd literally bled to defend. The shame was overwhelming. The Maple Grove HOA board meeting 3 days later was unlike any in the community's history. Word had spread with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with neighbors who had never spoken to Samuel Washington suddenly understanding the magnitude of their collective failure.
Margaret Thornfield stood at the podium, her usual commanding presence replaced by visible humility. Behind her, Samuel's medals were displayed in a place of honor, not as trophies, but as a reminder of the man they'd failed to see. "I owe this community an apology," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But more importantly, I owe Mr. Washington an apology that no words can adequately express." She announced the immediate suspension of all fines against Samuel's property. More than that, the HOA would be establishing the Samuel Washington Community Service Fund, using money from their legal war chest to help elderly and disabled residents maintain their homes. But the most powerful moment came when Samuel himself finally stood to speak. "I didn't serve for recognition," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I served because this country, for all its flaws, is worth protecting. That includes protecting the right of neighbors to live in peace, to plant wildflowers instead of perfect grass, and to place a garden gnome wherever they see fit." The applause was thunderous, but Samuel wasn't finished. "What happened here isn't about me. It's about how we treat the vulnerable among us, how we judge people by appearances rather than character, how we let fear and prejudice masquerade as community standards." 6 months later, Maple Grove looked different. Samuel's wildflower garden had inspired others to embrace native landscaping. The community had voted to relax many of its restrictive covenants, allowing residents to express their individuality while maintaining property values through genuine community pride rather than fear-based enforcement. Margaret Thornfield had quietly resigned from the HOA board and taken a job volunteering at the local VA hospital, working to understand the needs of veterans she'd spent years overlooking. In justice to a satisfying reversal, with Samuel Washington's quiet strength, ultimately transforming an entire community's understanding of what really matters.